Hello everyone, I am Demented Kirby, and welcome to my channel, the Commander Tavern. Every now and again, an EDH outcast can find their way to the Commander Tavern, and that's okay because all are welcome here. This should be a place where you can relax and make friends, a place where everybody knows your name. That's why this episode of the brewery contains a special segment titled A Toast, where it's going to focus on a commander way down in ranking on EDH Rec. Out of the 111 possible partner commander pairings legal in the format, this particular pair is at the helm of only 79 decks in EDH Rec, which is why today I toast the partner team of Tana the Bloodsower and Reyhan, last of the Abzan. And if you're a patron of the Commander Tavern, then you're seeing this episode earlier. Tana is a 2/2 elf druid with trample for 2 generic, 1 red, and 1 green. Whenever she deals combat damage to a player, you create that many 1/1 green sapperling creature tokens. This ability is great on its own, and you could very easily brew a commander deck revolving solely around Tana. Fortunately, she has partner, so you're able to combine her ability with another legendary creature from Commander 2016. In this deck tech, that partner is Reyhan, a 0/0 human warrior for 1 generic, 1 black, and 1 green that enters the battlefield with 3+1/+1 counters. She also has, whenever a creature you control dies or is put into the command zone, if it had 1 or more +1/+1 counters on it, you may put that many +1/+1 counters on target creature. This is a great support ability since it allows you to somewhat keep a creature's +1/+1 counters should that creature die. You're also able to play around with this ability by shifting +1/+1 counters from one creature to another in order to make creatures bigger. This is very useful in a combat-driven deck since you're able to recover counters from a fallen creature. Since the main way to create tokens is with Tana smashing face, it's crucial to get her out early in order to hit players before they get any potential blockers out. That's why this deck is running fast mana rocks like Mox Diamond, Mox Opal, Mox Amber, Mana Crypt, and Soul Ring. It's also running cheap ramp spells like Farseek, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits. This way, you can be able to get Tana out before turn 3 or 4. The other ramp spell I'm running is Sky Shroud Claim. It might be overcosted at 4 mana, but the forests it puts into play don't have to enter tapped, meaning that it frees up 2 lands for mana, making it technically cost 2 to cast. In order to make Tana hit players early, Lightning Greaves is also included so that she can attack the turn she comes into play. Not only that, but the Greaves have the added bonus of giving her Shroud. However, Tana needs to be able to hit an opponent in order to trigger her ability. That's pretty much guaranteed if you make her unblockable. Equipping Tana with Whisper Silk Cloak is guaranteed unblockable. It also has the added bonus of giving her Shroud. You can also make Tana unblockable with Rogue's Passage. It might seem a bit overcosted since you have to pay 4 mana as well as tapping it down, but the deck is able to generate a ton of mana, but I'll get into that much later on. It's also an ability on a mana producing land, so it doesn't really take up a slot in the deck. In a multiplayer game of Commander, it's not so unlikely for an opponent to run a non-basic land. The moment a player does, Trailblazer's Boots makes Tana unblockable, thanks to it giving her non-basic land walk. Shadow is a keyword that not many people play with. Thus, giving Tana Shadow with a card like Dothy's Embrace can essentially make her unblockable for just 2 black mana. You can also make the decision to block Tana difficult for your opponents by giving her Death Touch. If they don't have a chump blocker, they'll risk losing a key creature by blocking Tana. So you basically took out one of their creatures at the cost of not getting Sapperling tokens. This is achievable with cards like Oran Frostfang and Bow of Nylea. However, these cards also serve multiple purposes, so they're even better in this deck. So I'm going to discuss the latter 2 in different sections of this deck tech. You can also give Tana flying with Eldrazi Monument as well as all of your other creatures. They also gain +1/+1 and indestructible. Sure, you might have to sacrifice a creature each upkeep, but that's what the Sapperling tokens are for. Giving all your creatures indestructible is also good against board wipes. It's worth mentioning that although it's preferable to just make Tana unblockable to ensure her getting through to deal combat damage, she does have built-in trample. That means that if she's big enough, she's going to trample through an opponent's defenses. And that's where Reyhan's abilities become relevant. If our creatures are getting +1/+1 counters, Then through the various synergistic interactions in the deck, those counters can end up on Tana, making her huge in order to not just get through with combat damage, but large enough to create a ton of saprolings. Oh, and not just for creating saprolings. If Tana gives 21 commander damage to an opponent, then you just eliminated them from the game. The deck runs various ways of getting +1/+1 counters on those saprolings. Grumgully the Generous gives a +1/+1 counter to our non-human creatures when they enter the battlefield. Fortunately, the deck only runs 3 humans and one of them is Reyhan, who enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on herself anyways. Yet, Grumgully makes each saproling token created enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it. With Reyhan in play, when those tokens die, you can put their +1/+1 counters onto Tana. Making her larger means creating even more saprolings to replace those dead ones. Similarly, Path of Discovery has the potential of placing a +1/+1 counter on our creatures when they enter the battlefield due to the Explore mechanic. On top of that, Explore is a great mechanic in and of itself since we can also put lands into our hand off the top of a library. So it's win-win. We either get a +1/+1 counter or a land. Besides these 2 cards, we also have Oran Reef the Vastwood. Although it enters the battlefield tapped, it can be tapped for green when we need the mana. When we don't, it can be tapped at the beginning of our end step in order to give a +1/+1 counter to all our green creatures that enter the battlefield that turn. And what color do those saproling tokens happen to be? Green. Nissa Voice of Zendikar can also put a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures by removing 2 loyalty counters from her. Fortunately, she can recover loyalty counters by creating a plant token, something that not only defends her but can receive +1/+1 counters as well. As an added bonus, her ultimate, which isn't too hard to achieve, can draw us a bunch of cards as well as gaining us life. Necropolis Regent might seem like a crap mythic, but in this deck it pulls its weight. It might cost a whopping 3 generic and 3 black to cast, but trust me when I say this deck can quite easily generate the mana to cast it. With it in play, whenever our creatures deal combat damage, they get that many +1/+1 counters placed on them. That's just crazy with all the synergy in the deck. Death's Presence is Reyhan in enchantment form for twice the mana. So why include it? Redundancy. But not just redundancy. Death Presence doesn't just give +1/+1 counters based on +1/+1 counters like Reyhan, but based on power instead. So if this enchantment is in play and we're sacrificing saprolings, we can distribute +1/+1 counters even if the token didn't have any on it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's something I'll be discussing soon enough. Remember Bow of Nylea? One of its modes when activated is placing a +1/+1 counter on target creature. Its other modes are also relevant in the deck since you can shoot at flying creatures, gain life, or bottom deck 4 cards from your graveyard. Another great card in the deck is Bloodspore Threenax. Not only because it gives your creatures as many +1/+1 counters on them when they enter the battlefield as it has on itself, but it has Devour 1. That means that it also functions as a sacrifice outlet. As I just mentioned, that's something that will be discussed later on. A similar effect can be found on Mazarek Kraul Death Priest. Whenever anyone sacrifices a permanent, it puts a +1/+1 counter on all of our creatures. That means that whenever anyone cracks a fetch land, all our creatures get a +1/+1 counter. In and of itself, that ability is crazy. But when you combine it with the sacrifice outlets the deck contains, then you can begin to understand the depth of the synergy in the deck. There's also a couple of cards to multiply the amount of +1/+1 counters placed on creatures. Pure Imaginative Rascal increases the amount of counters placed on our permanents. As a bonus, he doesn't just care about +1/+1 counters on our creatures, but loyalty counters placed on our planeswalkers and lore counters on Tome of Legends, a card I'll be discussing much later on. When combined with Mazarek Kraul Death Priest, Pur can get out of hand very quickly. Karn's Bastion has a similar function since it proliferates when you pay 4 and tap it. Since it's on a land, it doesn't really take up a slot in the deck. Other doublers in the deck include Doubling Season and Primal Vigor. These are by far the best ones because they also double the amount of tokens created. Although Doubling Season can duplicate all counters like lore counters and loyalty counters, Primal Vigor only doubles +1/+1 counters. That being said, you could use Primal Vigor as a political card since it can also duplicate +1/+1 counters and tokens for opponents. Beware though, if an opponent has Smothering Tithe or other cards that generate tokens, you might not want to cast that Primal Vigor. Before moving on, I want to mention that you don't need to pump Tana with just +1/+1 counters. Eldrazi Conscription might seem like overkill, but giving Tana +10/+10 for just 8 mana while giving her Annihilator 2 is just icing on the cake. 8 generic mana might seem like a lot, but again, trust me when I say this, the deck generates a ton of mana. Either way, Tana has built-in trample, so having her be 12/12 is no joke. You can also use Loxodon Warhammer to give her +3/+0 but also lifelink. There will be times where your army will make you the arch enemy, or inspire opponents to wipe the board. You'd then lose all of your counters for want of having a creature in play, but equipment remains. It also has lifelink to recover any life from getting smacked around ourselves. Or maybe you're still set because your army is indestructible thanks to Eldrazi Monument I mentioned earlier, some time ago. Another way to pump Tana is with Keswick Wolfrun. Although it gives trample, Tana already has trample. This land is a great mana sink and can help Tana get big enough to break through to create a lot of tokens. Not only that, but it can also help deal enough commander damage to eliminate a player. But we don't need to only focus on Tana. Reyhan isn't just for playing around with +1/+1 counters. You can also sink enough mana into Keswick Wolfrun to give her +X/+0 and trample in order to take out an opponent with commander damage. Remember, there are 2 commanders to this deck after all. Okay, so if all these +1/+1 counter cards can somehow function as a proxy to Reyhan, especially Death's Presence, what about Tana? Surely she can't be the only token generator in the deck. And you'd be right, she isn't. The deck runs Tendershoot Dryad and Ulash the Hate Seed. Not only does Tendershoot Dryad create a Sapperling each upkeep, they also get +2/+2 if you have the City's Blessing. Something easily achievable in a deck like this. With all the green tokens, Ulash very easily enters with a bunch of +1/+1 counters on it. Even then, if we don't have a lot of green and red creatures in play, there are plenty of ways to give it +1/+1 counters. Then, for just 1 generic and removing one of those counters, it creates a Sapperling token. Although not creating tokens of its own, similar to Doubling Season and Primal Vigor, Parallel Lives doubles the amount of creature tokens being created. Although the following spell might seem inefficient in the deck, Sprout Swarm is actually one of the possible win cons of the deck. It can create a Sapperling token at instant speed for just 2 mana, which can be bypassed thanks to its Convoke ability. Not only that, but it has a buyback of 3 generic mana, which can also be paid for by tapping down green creatures. With all the token doublers, you can already imagine how Sprout Swarm is a card that can get out of hand, but I'll discuss it in more detail later on. Alright, so what hijinks is this deck employing to synergize all these pieces together? Sacrifice outlets. Sacrificing creatures with +1/+1 counters at instant speed is the best way to move those counters from one creature to another. Did you just chump block with a creature that had a +1/+1 counter on it? Sacrifice it during the combat damage step of the combat phase to transfer its counters to another creature. Is one of your creatures unblocked? Sacrifice all your other creatures with +1/+1 counters on them to transfer those to that creature in order to give lethal combat damage. There's just so many things to do. The best sacrifice outlets, of course, being Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar. These abilities are mana abilities, so they can't even be countered by effects or abilities. These artifacts can give you a ton of mana all for free. You can sacrifice excess Sapperling tokens to cast expensive spells relatively early or efficiently in the mid to late game. Other sacrifice outlets include Sadistic Hypnotist. Although it has to be done at sorcery speed, you can use your Sapperling tokens to empty opponents' hands. This is great in order to get rid of answers, board wipes, removal spells, counter spells, etc. from opponents' hands. This makes them have to play whatever they draw in their turn before any of your main phases, because you can then just sacrifice a Sapperling to Sadistic Hypnotist in order to make them discard it. The other major sacrifice outlets are creatures with Devour. Devour is a mechanic that functions as a sacrifice outlet as well as a way to have creatures enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters on them. Also, since Devour triggers when the creature enters the battlefield, it's already on the battlefield. That means it can be targeted by Reyhan and her ability. I also mentioned Bloodspore 3-Nax. You sacrifice X creatures in order to give it X counters. Then it can give X +1/+1 counters on creatures entering the battlefield, where X is the amount of +1/+1 counters it has. With Reyhan in play, you can transfer +1/+1 counters on it in order to make your creatures even bigger when they enter the battlefield. Other creatures with Devour that are included in the deck are Mycoloth, Prey Caesar Dragon, and Thromach the Insatiable. Although there are more, I feel like these 4 are the best for the deck. Mycoloth can create X Saproling tokens during your upkeep, where X is the amount of +1/+1 counters on it. Although there are plenty of ways of getting +1/+1 counters on Mycoloth, it doesn't hurt that it gets 2 +1/+1 counters on it for each creature it devours. Devouring enough Saprolings can make it huge, which makes it a threat as well. It can also be quite the blocker. Prey Caesar Dragon can also get 2 +1/+1 counters for each creature it devours. It's included because of its attack triggered ability. It deals X damage to target creature or player, where X is the amount of +1/+1 counters on it. If it's big enough, it can take out an opponent in one fell swoop. Or, it can use its ability to destroy a creature by giving it enough damage. Along the same vein as Prey Caesar Dragon is Calculating Lich. Calculating Lich triggers during the combat step. Any creature attacking our opponents make them lose 1 life for each attacking creature. And this doesn't just trigger off of our own creatures either. Any creature will trigger it, even those controlled by opponents, as long as they're attacking any player that's one of our opponents. So, attacking with a swarm of Saprolings will take a huge chunk of life from our opponents before we even hit them. Okay, back to our creatures with Devour. The hungriest of those 4 is undoubtedly Thromach the Insatiable. True to its namesake, Thromach enters the battlefield with an insane amount of +1/+1 counters on it. In simple math, Devour X means that Thromach enters the battlefield with X squared, where X is the amount of creatures it devours. For example, if it devours 1 creature, it gets 1 counter. 2 creatures devoured gives it 4 counters. 3 creatures gives it 9 counters, etc. So if you devour 10 creatures, something very feasible in a deck like this, Thromach enters the battlefield with a whopping 100 +1/+1 counters on it. And that's not even taking into consideration effects from Doubling Season or Primal Vigor. Thromach might not have any built-in evasion to take advantage of this, but that's okay. Recall that the deck does run plenty of ways to give him various forms of evasion, like Unblockable, Non-Basic Land Walk, Trample, Shadow, etc. I would run Riding the Dilu Horse in order to grant horsemanship, as well as a boon of +2/+2 that doesn't go away at the end of turn. But I'd rather run Equipment since the deck is constantly sacrificing creatures. So the boons go away when the creature dies. Wizards definitely needs to print an equipment that gives horsemanship, at least in a supplemental product or a commander product. In order to take advantage of all the sacrifices, the deck runs cards that care about and trigger upon a creature being sacrificed. I already mentioned Mazarek and how it places a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control whenever anyone sacrifices a permanent. Although it's one of the best cards in the deck as far as sacrifice synergy goes, it's not the only one included. You know I have to include Dictate of Erebos and a Grave Pact in a deck like this. Every time one of our own creatures dies, we force our opponents to sacrifice one of their own. Being a token generating deck, we will almost always win any wars of attrition. With a cleared board, we can also attack with Total Abandon, especially with Tana, who's going to replace our Saprolings with new ones every time she connects. Moldervine Reclamation and Liliana Dreadhorde General draws a card whenever one of our creatures dies. Moldervine Reclamation has the added bonus of gaining us 1 life each time it triggers too. Liliana is also a well-rounded card in the deck apart from her triggered ability. She can get us a token by gaining 2 loyalty, a token that easily functions as a chump blocker or sacrifice fodder. She can also make every player sacrifice 2 creatures, something that has no negative impact on us since we can take advantage of sacrificing creatures. Since the deck has a couple of ways of incrementing all types of counters, her ultimate isn't that difficult to achieve. Having each opponent sacrifice most of their board can be pretty devastating, but that's not all. Pulling it off with Mazarek in play is all the more brutal. Another card that cares about our creatures dying is Slimefoot the Stowaway. Although Slimefoot only cares about Saprolings dying, it gains us 1 life while dealing 1 damage to each opponent when it does. This means that given enough Saprolings, we can sacrifice them all if it means killing off the entire table. If that weren't enough, it also has a mana sink that doesn't require tapping. For 4 generic mana, it can create a Saproling token. Talk about value. On the topic of value, let's discuss how all this synergy moves the deck forwards. Since the deck needs to keep opponents hurting, we can't run out of steam lest they surpass us in resources and gang up on us to take us out of the game. we need to ensure a continuous flow of cards. One of the best cards for that is Skull Clamp. For just 1 generic mana, we can equip it to a weak Saproling token in order to draw 2 cards. Doing this not only draws us cards though, it will also trigger cards that care about our creatures dying, like the previously mentioned Dictate of Erebos, Liliana, etc. Along the same vein as Mazarek, Corvold, Fey Cursed King also triggers when things get sacrificed, although it's only when our own things get sacrificed. Even so, it draws us a card every time we sacrifice something and it gets a +1/+1 counter on it. It's also a sacrifice outlet every time it enters the battlefield or is assigned as an attacker, so it's chocked full of value in a deck like this. Don't forget the previously mentioned Orang Frostfang. It makes our attackers less likely to be blocked, as well as providing us card draw whenever any of our creatures successfully smacks an opponent. Tome of Legends, a card I mentioned early on in the video, is crazy here since there are 2 commanders. You have 2 cards that can trigger it whenever they enter the battlefield or attack. Idol of Oblivion is another cheap artifact that provides cheap card draw as well. In this deck, we're constantly creating creature tokens, so being able to draw a card by simply tapping this artifact that costs only 2 generic mana is great value. Running out of steam isn't the only reason we want to keep drawing into a bunch of cards. We also need answers to our opponent's plays. Keeping with the synergy of the deck, I've included Steelbane Hydra. By paying 2 generic and 1 green, we can remove a +1/+1 counter from it in order to destroy target artifact or enchantment. It goes without saying that that's not a big deal in this deck. This is practically an everlasting naturalize on a body. Oh, and it doesn't even require tapping to activate, so we can do it as many times as we can. The deck also runs Freyalise Lanoir's Fury as a way of dealing with pesky artifacts and enchantments. Not only that, but Freyalise can also create a mana dork by gaining 2 loyalty counters. This is a token that can not only tap for mana, but it can also be used as a chump blocker or a sacrifice fodder. Her final ability is also incredibly relevant in the deck and quite epic when pulled off. We get to draw a card for each green creature we control. Given how the deck has various ways of increasing all types of counters, this is quite feasible to pull off reliably. And with all the green creatures in the deck as well as green tokens being created, we're going to draw into quite the hand. The deck runs Assassin's Trophy and Beast Within to get rid of any problematic permanent in play. These answers are cheap as well as fast. Although there are already a couple of ways of dealing with artifacts and enchantments, I've also included Force of Vigor for good measure. It can be played for free in a pinch and it gets rid of 2 targets. Since this deck is aimed for multiplayer, it's important to be able to take out multiple things at once. That's why I've included Decimate and Casualties of War. Although Decimate can get rid of 4 targets, there has to be 4 legal targets for the spell to not fizzle, as well for the spell to be even cast. Casualties of War doesn't suffer from that problem, but that's probably why it costs more. At least it has the option of also getting rid of a Planeswalker. In order to take advantage of all that card advantage, there needs to be a steady flow of mana as well. As mentioned in the beginning of the video, the deck has ways to generate early mana. However, starting ahead doesn't imply staying ahead. Since this is a deck that's cranking out a bunch of creatures, it aims to make the absolute most of it, so it takes advantage of that in its mana generation. Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar were already mentioned as efficient ways of generating mana while also providing free sacrifice outlets, but they aren't the only efficient sources of mana. Cryptolith Rite can help generate a crazy amount of mana. You can even tap down a creature for mana first and then sacrifice it for even more mana. This makes all of your creatures birds of paradise. So even when a handful of creatures in play, you might be able to generate enough mana to put Eldrazi Conscription onto Tana fairly easily. Or cast that Necropolis Regent that's a bit uncomfortable to cast. The deck also runs Growing Rites of Itlimoc. Not only can this be used to filter the top 4 cards of the deck for a creature, but if you control at least 4 creatures at the beginning of your end step, it becomes an improved Gaia's Cradle. Speaking of, the deck also runs Gaia's Cradle. This land is crazy here due to all the tokens being created. Alright, so having discussed all of these interactions with the deck, how does it win? Surely combat can't be the only route to victory. And you'd be right. I wanted this deck overflowing with synergy. I don't want to just create tokens. I want to be able to block and attack with them. I want to sacrifice them for value. I want those tokens to do something when entering the battlefield. And these win cons do just that. Perforos, God of the Forge, and Impact Tremors trigger when a creature enters the battlefield under our control. Although these cards can provide a slow burn over the long haul, they can also immediately kill off the entire table if enough creature tokens are created at once. Remember the Sprout Swarm I mentioned a while back? With enough token doublers in play or ways to generate mana, we could be able to recast it from our hand infinitely many times in a single turn. Doing so with either Perforos or Impact Tremors in play will get us the win. Fiendish Duo can augment this even further. It doubles the amount of damage inflicted on our opponents. It's from any source too, so even if an opponent taps a Pain land for colored mana, they'll receive 2 damage thanks to these devils. Also, this means that anyone else hurting our opponents can also hurt them twice as hard. So, whenever we smack or burn or ping our opponents or other opponents do, they get twice that damage. This can definitely make for shorter games. Aggravated Assault is another card that leads to shorter games. If you're able to activate it after every combat, you'd have infinite combat and can thus eliminate the table that way. If you have Cryptolith right in play, this can definitely help with infinite combat steps as well as infinite mana. You can also achieve this with Tana and Phyrexian Altar. If she's able to create enough tokens to sacrifice to Phyrexian Altar, then you can use that mana for an additional combat step and then continue on with enough combat steps to take out the table. The rest of the deck is the rest of the lands. The deck runs all 10 fetch lands, all 3 dual lands, all 3 shock lands, and 2 of each snow basic in case our opponents are running anything that benefits us for running them. The deck includes Ancient Tomb and Temple of the False God for the double mana, while Command Tower, Reflecting Pool, Daragaz's Caldera, City of Brass, Mana Confluence, Luxury Suite, and Spire Garden are for the colors. As I've mentioned in previous videos, you don't need to run such an expensive mana base. You can just as easily swap out the Moxen, fetch lands, and dual lands for more budget options and still have a great deck. This deck is a lot of fun to play, and I hope I have inspired some of you with this spicy brew. I hope that this segment of A Toast has exposed more players to the partnership of Tana and Reyhan. This particular episode was a bit lengthy, but that sort of thing happens when there are so many synergistic interactions in a deck. I would like to thank all my patrons for supporting me, and a quick shout out to all my higher tier patrons, the brewers, for their patronage. And to everyone, thanks for watching this episode of The Brewery on the Commander Tavern. I am Demented Kirby, and happy brewing.